The French let us down, the Italians let us down. But, so I don't know what any Africans or whatever wanted to be in it for, you know.
1939. Led by Adolf Hitler, Nazi Germany began a campaign of brutal conquest. By 1940, its armies had marched into almost every country in Europe and taken them over. Only Britain was left to oppose the Nazis. Hitler was determined to destroy this last obstacle. His navy set up blockades in the Atlantic. At the same time, he sent his mighty air force, the Luftwaffe, to bomb Britain.
Soon the nightly Battle of London will be on. This has been a quiet day for us, but it won't be a quiet night. We haven't had a quiet night now for more than 5 weeks. They'll be over tonight, and they'll destroy a few buildings and kill a few people. Probably some of the people you are watching now.
Thousands of people, civilians and servicemen and women, were killed. Cities and industries were devastated. Close to collapse, Britain was forced to turn overseas for help to her colonies. Many of us now do not know or choose to forget that Britain once had an empire. These were the countries scattered around the world that Britain herself had taken over, and now flew the British flag. Before the war, the British West Indies were ruled by a white colonial administration that largely excluded the black population. Food was scarce, and there were strikes and political unrest.
We had a lot of other West Indian islands involved with conflicts, and that went on quite some time. For instance, there was a lot of class distinction, I would say, with the working class and the upper class.
In Jamaica, as far as I can remember, you have the Europeans. They were the ones under the old colonial system. They were in charge, and then you have the Jamaicans that were privileged, that's the upper class Jamaican, and you got the middle class Jamaican, and then you got the ordinary Jamaican, and that was the setup.
I think he had a very lovely childhood, actually. Playing piano, and his mum was teaching piano, and he was very close to his brothers and sisters.
His dad was a Moravian minister, and they lived next door to the church, and they had a very privileged, as you said, background with servants, and they did have stuff. They did,
yeah.
didn't they?
There was also a political consciousness growing, and certainly in Jamaica just before the war there were strikes, there was agitation.
The white colonials were controlling the country during that time. I mean, if you wanted something to progress in your life, you had to approach them first.
He was incredibly proud of his black roots and angry as a young man that he was never taught black history as a child. You know, he was sort of couldn't figure out why he was learning about Oliver Cromwell and all the wives of Henry VIII.
Great Britain was revered by many people as the mother country. They sang God Save the King and learned about British history and often aspired to be British. Before the war, Britain was not the multicultural society we know today. Black faces were rare.
I was born at Hurstbeer Point in West Sussex. It was only a small little town, really, and this was out in the country. I suppose really the best way of describing it was rather idyllic. Oh, we were free, easy, front doors weren't locked. Being English, yes, I suppose the fact was when we were brought up, everything was English. We had English meals at home. We led a more English life than we would, say, a British life.
Yeah, I met a few coloured people, not many, because there obviously wasn't the ethnic background then that there is now. They were no different than anybody else.
When I was a boy, we only saw basically two coloured people. One was an Indian with a turban, by goodness gracious meat man, who used to come round and sell scarves and silk ties. And the other man was a big black Negro who was, I can't remember, I think we nicknamed him Cherry Blossom. Wouldn't do today, but he came round and he was a tipster for horse racing.
I've lived in Dulwich and I've worked in Dulwich. I went to school in Dulwich. 91 years. This is now.
People didn't move about. You knew your neighbours knew you. And there was much more friendly atmosphere. It was good living in those days.
This country is at war with Germany. And now that we have resolved to finish it, I know that you will all play your part.
In desperate need of manpower in both the armed forces and the manufacturing industries, Britain sent out recruitment drives to the West Indies and the African colonies of the Empire.
Churchill advertised in the Jamaican cleaner, and they desperately need manpower to come and serve in the forces. And they decided to ask people to join the Royal Air Force in Jamaica. And surprisingly, I read the cleaner that week, and I went past the queue for some unknown reason and went straight in, and I became the 39th man to join the Royal Air Force. And within a couple of days, I went home back to my mother and told her I was out on a ship to England. I knew nothing about England. I heard the call.
More than 16,000 from the Caribbean and 1 million from Africa heard the call and signed up. They had different reasons for volunteering their services.
When I was 18, I volunteered for the Royal Air Force. And my mother said, son, the mother country is at war, go. And if you live, it would be a good thing. She was right. Let us get this straight. The Germans wanted to rule the world. And if they had won, they put a few people in ovens and light the fire. They would do almost the same to us. So it was a good thing to fight for our own salvation.
Guyana is not the place you want to make a living, and England was calling, and to join the RAF was what these guys did.
I think it was his ticket out of Guyana, really.
That's what you said.
Family wasn't rich enough to send me abroad to study, and I just wanted to go together. My parents didn't know I was in the Air Force until I left.
My parents had ideas. I had my own ideas because as a kid I used to, my father was a role model to me, and his uniform and its importance. I said to myself, well, that is my life, but he didn't want me to do that. My father was the skipper of the inter-island cargo ship. He was the first black skipper.
Well, I'm from Sierra Leone. I have two heads. My father is from Sierra Leone, my mother is from Nigeria. What they did was to actually come to the schools and they look for everybody that is above a certain particular standard. You know how to read geometry, algebra, English, and you must get your certificate of all those kind of things. I had to join the West African Air Corps, and it was from there they started to see how they can recruit us to become members, and we were trained. What they did was they looked at people who can actually be trained to be pilots. Because in Sierra Leone, all they did was they recruited for pilots and engineers.
In Britain, many young people were called up or conscripted, and some volunteered.
In 1941 I went in the army. I mean, and all they did was call you up by a letter through the door and a train ticket to report to wherever. I wasn't conscripted, I was called up. Because if you were conscripted, that was for 3 years. You didn't know when you were going to come out when I went in. All right, I was there and scare them then.
A lot of people wanted to get in the Army or the Air Force because they got better conditions there than they got at home. Well, the food was, well, marginally better. You slept on your own where you might have been sleeping with your brothers, and you had a bathroom.
When I was about 18 all my friends was in the army. They kept on coming home on leave and saying what a good life it was. That's what made me join up, because they was always on leave and I was always flogging it out.
It was a devastating time. I might say here that had I not been conscripted, I would have joined the army anyway, because the country was absolutely united. There was, you know, apart from a few people with conscientious objection on religious or moral grounds, everybody played their part quite well.
If I had to go, I had to go.
When the young recruits first arrived in Britain, it was a shock in many ways. The mother country was not what they expected. It was not a magical realm of splendid palaces and fine houses.
We have never seen a country like this before. We have never seen snow before. Well, snow falling from the sky was something phenomenal. And if you have never seen snow before, those who are born and grown up in England, you should be taken for granted today. But in those days, it was something special.
It's first thing I noticed that all the laundries and everything were hanging up just like how you're washing in lines, just how we do in Africa and everything. And we found they can swear and do every kind of thing just like us. So they were friendly, and you get the children where some of them were big, running barefoot.
And for the first time we saw these funny so-called white men with tattoos or crude-looking looks, because before the so-called white people were respectable administrative officers or something there.
There was a Jamaican who joined the RAF called Dudley Thompson, who explains this very, very well. That to be able to walk into a library anywhere in England and there was no colour bar, you could pick up a book, you could read it, you could learn about the world. That was not possible in Jamaica, where he came from.
For the vast majority of the British population, it would be the first time they had seen a black person.
When their training is complete, they will go to aircraft or ordnance factories or machine shops. There are also others from several West Indian islands who volunteered and were chosen for their skill, and on arrival were immediately introduced into production in the united effort to beat Hitler and his gang.
I went to RAF Filey near Scarborough, Yorkshire. After about 2 months training, I became an aircraft engineer. If you have propeller-driven aircraft and it stops, you can still ring Sam King. Old-fashioned like Lancaster, Dakotas, Spitfires, Hurricane, like that.
I did 8 weeks of training in Cardington. I learned how to march, I learned how to carry equipment, I learned to fire guns, I learned sorry to put it this way, you have to learn to shoot people. And there I was on a firing range, firing a gun. And, you know, from a Christian background, what am I doing here firing a gun on Good Friday?
That's me there, what I look like, you see, when I was in the Air Force. And that's why when I joined the Air Force there, that's what I look like. You see, you can see how slim I look like. Down here you will see all my buddies that were in the training school with us. These are all our signatures when we say goodbye to each other before they send us to different squadrons.
I joined the Royal Navy in 1941 and I served on the HMS Hawking, which was a minesweeper. And then 1943 I transferred to the RAF, Air Sea Rescue Service, and I served on the rescue boats.
the black recruits were generally warmly received by their fellow British servicemen.
In the Navy, you're on a ship and your family. So you more or less coordinate with each other, because your survival depends on each other. And fortunately, there wasn't much of us, just 6 of us Jamaicans. The rest were English and 1 or 2 Europeans. We had to fit in with each other. We were brothers because, everybody's life depended on each other.
It was an education for both black and white servicemen, as neither had any experience or awareness of the other's culture. It is important to remember that in those days there was no television or internet.
There were not many West Indians in most camps. I think there was about 4 of us, 5 of us in most camps. But I was privileged. I worked with people from Norway to the Sudan. But Britain was at war, and they were glad to have us.
At first, the surprise I had touched me that much because in our school days in Ceylon, we were taught to speak Oxford English, you understand? And their English was distinct, very distinct, you had to be clear. And others, they were the one that read the news, and they were the one that held all the positions somehow. Well, eventually in the end, when I met with them, I just don't know exactly whether I was talking to an Englishman or not. Because some of the accents were different. Some were called Jock, and some were called Taffy, and some were called different names. And their accents were so different that much. It took me some time to, I beg your pardon, I can't just understand what they were saying. But eventually one gets used to them when you mix with it. Then I managed to find that they were just exactly like us. You get, in West Africa, you get different tongues and different accents.
British Empire had the men who administered, and the men in Trinidad in the colonial days were all the top positions, or Englishmen or something like that. They knew nothing of us. They knew nothing of us at all. Even some of the senior flight sergeants or warrant officers, they honestly thought we lived in trees in Jamaica. And when we realized that they did, we kept it going. Said, yes, we live on a tall tree, and we will invite you for dinner. And if you come, when you're coming up the tree, we'll cut the ladder, and if you don't fall and break your foot, you're accepted. And it's unbelievable nonsense like that we used to get away with.
The question that they used to ask, if I live in trees, where did I learn English? How did I get in the RAF? Presently, I decided to re-educate them as much as I could.
When we spoke among ourselves, Jamaican patois or whatever things we and they didn't, a lot of Englishmen together, they didn't understand what they were saying. And sometimes they would ask them, what language you boys speaking? And I remember one friend of mine said, yeah, algebra. We got away with almost murder, you could say in some instances,
When the United States entered the war and American soldiers began arriving in Britain, they brought something with them that was another new experience: racial segregation.
The Air Force bases in England had a lot of problems with the white troops, but most of all, West Indians, Jamaicans, and those from the Caribbean had problems with the white Americans.
They brought their racism. We were more or less the protectors for the black Americans, when they're on leave pass.
It wasn't all, we're bowing down to the wonderful Americans that have come. There was a lot of resistance to that kind of racism. Very, very interesting. And a lot of that comes from the fact that the British people could see that the Americans were practicing the same kind of fascism that the Nazis were, which is what they were all supposed to be fighting about.
The white population here didn't really get on well with them. And whenever we have any conflict, the population here was always on our side. Most of the women fighting and the men helping us.
I think it's a marvellous example of not what we expect when we look back through history, that these kind of villagers living in their lovely little cottages with the roses outside in this idyllic kind of world actually were fighting racism in the middle of the war. Good for them.
We did have a crew on our squadron. The two gunners, one was a Chinaman and the other was an Englishman. And they were unlikely because now the Chinaman's name was Q, just QU. And the other gunner, his name was Fluck. Now you can imagine what that turned into, very simply, because that's what they were called, that crew. But they survived.
If you were in just forces grouped together, a group of men together doing a job, when you're doing work collectively, you don't worry about your people's color, because if Hitler drop a bomb, it has no color in it, it kills everybody.
For many servicemen, war was a harrowing experience, especially in combat.
The aircraft are flying daily, nightly, and constantly flying, and you just got to get on with it. There was no place to hide, because when the Germans came over, they dropped bombs on you. You had to go to shelter. If you're brave enough, you would stay where you are and say, if you die, in my case, I say, if I die, so what?
I knew that we had lost a lot of people. Coventry, London, Glasgow, Liverpool, and all the other British cities that had been bombed, and the thousands of British people that had been killed. Our object in mind was to win the war.
I went on a motorbike. I went with an officer there on another motorbike and a couple of DRs. They went, there's a Bren carrier in that field, we've got to go and drag it in. And it was a minefield, and we just went across this minefield. And when we got to this Bren carrier, I didn't know what death smelt like, but I just went, there's somebody dead here.
The crews get shut down in the channel or in it where we got to go and rescue them, you know, before they freeze to death. All different jobs. You're steering, assisting in the rescue, so we had to defend ourselves at times. According to the count, we saved 18,000 lives over the period of war.
He was flying over Holland. They were attacked and the Lancaster literally blew up. He parachuted, luckily, it's amazing because the hatch didn't open apparently. So I think it was a last minute escape, and he came down in a field, ended up in a prisoner of war camp.
Right. Yeah, a quite famous one actually.
I met Flight Lieutenant Cross twice personally and saw him a few times afterwards. He ended up as a squadron leader, and this is what I've heard, that he, I think I read it too, he bombed Germany 80-something times. He landed a bomber when the rest of the crew, I think a crew of 8, 5 of them were shot up. The pilot was dead, the co-pilot, the gunners, and he was the navigator air bomber.
I watched all the troops come in at Arnhem, and I watched the gliders come in, and I watched the Germans shooting them as they jumped out of the gliders. I saw so many people got killed like that, you got no chance.
I was one of those who was servicing the aircraft. They loaded up the aircraft with men, with guns and bombs and so forth, and flew down on them. Unfortunately, on that day, the weather changed. The German got hints that the British forces were going to land and capture that part of Holland, and they were waiting for them, and they just massacred them. Thousands, hundreds of soldiers died that weekend. I was here in England. Very few got back alive, and that's the nature of war.
But I had a chap the side of me, and he was about 45, come from up north, and he was crying his eyes out, and he couldn't get his fingers into the ground far enough because he kept saying he was going to get killed. Well, that made you scared while you were sitting there, you know what I mean? It made you frightened. But those people got called up at the same time as me. They were 45 years, 40, 45. They were expected to do the same thing as me.
When one's sitting in one turret and is on operations, and you're flying at anything between 14 to 20,000 feet, it is cold. Over Europe it can get down to easy -40 centigrade. And it wouldn't be unusual from your oxygen mask, little icicles hanging down from condensation that froze up. You were searching the skies. You were looking for other aircraft, friend or foe. Mostly if you found a foe, well, you could take evasive action. So there it was, you just sat there and you searched the sky.
While black servicemen generally experienced little racial prejudice among their British comrades and the civilian population, there was still institutional racism.
Although war is on, although you're serving, but where promotion is concerned, you're always, something is always missing that you're not able to be promoted. And the simple reason is, it's very hard to come to conclusion, but they didn't want any black faces to be in charge. At the time, you thought more or less, oh, well, I'm here to do a job, so I might as well do it. And don't think of it, because at that age, you weren't politically aware of all these things happening.
Ulrich Cross, who is a hero and was highly decorated for his war work in the RAF, did manage to get promotion, but he was from a very educated middle-class Trinidadian background. Much harder if you were from a Jamaican farming family, for example. When we look back, it is clear that Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister during the war, was an inspiring leader. They needed someone like that to help mobilise them, someone they could identify with, who was strong, outspoken. It was understood that black soldiers, black RAF personnel could not kill whites. That there was that kind of feeling.
But there were lighter moments. Black volunteers experienced ordinary social life on leave. Some even found romance with white girls.
Life was tough, because if you married a white woman, you had to look after yourself. You might be attacked, or you might be injured, or something might happen to you as a black man, because there was still hidden racism in the country.
Love is blind. Some of them would give their lives for their boyfriend or for their husband. I nearly married a girl, Betty, from Victoria, Nottingham. But funny enough, my English family thought I shouldn't marry a girl from Victoria, because my parents had written to them and says that we're not too bad, we have a few acres. But no, love is blind. She married somebody else. She married a fellow from Guildford, sorry. So that's that.
I personally did not make color as important at the time. I just saw her as another woman. But probably the members of the public saw it differently, because you probably go out with a white girl, you take her to the pictures, because in those days that's the only place you take her to movies, just cheap, and that's what we could afford. But one didn't see it special as a special thing to do, and white girls weren't seen as something special other than black women, because as I said before, there are not a lot of black women over here.
And we used to have some really marvellous times. And you wouldn't think that, would you, during the war? But you do, you forget all your worries and everything when you get, into a sort of situation where you can have a lovely dance and have a jump around and forget everything else that worries you. And that's how we were. And I must admit, the Jamaicans were really a nice lot of guys. Really lovely, eh? It was at a little place in Nottingham, where all the West Indians used to get in this little place. We used to do a lot of jitterbugging and jiving. And I met Laurie, and straight away we got together, we knew how to dance together, it was lovely. So that's when the jitterbugging was all going mad, it was lovely.
The war ended in 1945. There were mass celebrations everywhere. Then began the slow process of returning to normal.
the British public needed and desperately wanted to go back to pre-war, what they perceived as pre-war normality, the rose-covered cottage, the kind of idyllic England that they had been fed before the war. That did not include black people, but neither did it include, let's be fair, women, British women who had come out of the home and worked in the factories and joined the services.
Servicemen were sent back to their homes. For Africans and West Indians, this meant repatriation. Frequently, life back home was just as difficult as it had been before the war.
Women were expected to go back to the kitchen. Black recruits, if they were from the West Indies, go back. African recruits go back once that uniform came off.
I got a job in Jamaica, but unfortunately they weren't expecting us to come back, and nothing was done for rehabilitation. And around that time we heard that England was in the stage of rebuilding, and we thought more or less that if we came back to England we would stand a chance to get a job and to start a life.
Britain's cities, factories and industries had been pounded to rubble. So she once again called on the colonies to offer their services. In 1948, the former troop ship, the Empire Windrush, brought nearly 500 mostly black returnees to Britain.
It was a recruitment drive. It was a recruitment drive in the Caribbean for mainly men, but some women, to fill the jobs that the British didn't want. The lower paid jobs, because a lot of the British people after the war wanted a better life as well.
My parents came to England, like I think a lot of other Caribbean parents did. They came because England wanted help. And that's why I've always said, you know, Britain has never had a more loyal citizen than the people from the Caribbean. They said, well, we're going to go to England, we're going to stay for 5 years or 10 years, and then we're going to go back because we were helped enough by them. But we're still here. And second, third, fourth generations are still here. So that's what's happened.
These black men and women were no longer in uniform, coming into a country that struggled with rationing, run-down services and housing problems. The shortages of homes in particular fueled racial tensions.
In 1950, there was a ad says room to let. I went to Stockwell where it was. I took a man. When I got there, it says no Irish, no blacks, no dogs. Very hurtful.
And that they got away with that for a time. Of course, it's not until very recent years that the law took a stand against that kind of thing.
But it was a blessing. We had to buy property, resulting that if you bought a 3-bedroom house in Brixton Hill for $2,500 in 1950, today it's $500,000.
They couldn't get white people to do it, so I mean, what was the objection? The only thing that struck me was these chaps turned up with big, huge trilby hats and what they called zoot suits, I think, down to their knees. And of course they spoke in their own lingo. That's always irritating.
Welcome war heroes had become unwelcome immigrants.
Something new and ugly raises its head in Britain. In Notting Hill Gate, only a mile or two from London's West End, racial violence. An angry crowd of youths chases a Negro into a greengrocer shop, while police reinforcements are called up to check the riot. One of many that have broken out here in a few days.
Unbelievable, but yeah, this is what's happening in England. You have routine racist attacks against black people. So what happens in Notting Hill in 50 is that the black people decide to fight back as a group. And what's interesting about that fight back is that it includes a lot of veterans.
My friends were mostly ex-servicemen and they could handle themselves. And they got organized. And as soon as they got organized and started now to fight back, it suddenly went quiet. They got machetes and everything handy. They were, you know, they were well prepared to fight back. And once the Teddy boys, they realized that they were against opposition, it just disappeared.
So that was an indication of then what was to come.
In 1964, Conservative politician Peter Griffiths successfully ran on an anti-immigration ticket.
Where do you intend to put the coloured people who can't get houses in Marshall Street?
Well, that isn't our problem. That is the problem of the immigrant himself.
This delegation to the council was purely to try and make a stand to stop the road completely being taken over by coloured people.
That our social services, our housing, our whole environment in some of our big towns and cities would be congested and overloaded to the point where it would be impossible to carry out one of the most difficult problems any country's had to do in recent times, and that is to assimilate the immigrants among our own population.
The normal, you know, I don't like you niggers, that's easy to deal with. Come around the back and we deal with it. The other ones where you think you are accepted because you're carrying the Queen's crown in your head and you cannot advance any further, that's the one that hurts.
In 1968, senior Tory Enoch Powell made his apocalyptic Rivers of Blood speech.
This country, in 15 or 20 years' time, the black man will have the whip hand over the white man.
A fifth or a quarter of such towns and cities as Wolverhampton, Birmingham and inner London will in course of time consist of the Commonwealth immigrants and their descendants. There has been no attempt at refutation.
The politicians start to do more or less stir up the public, because people felt that you came here, the immigrants came here to take away their jobs. They had parades and meetings and all that to start to say the government should send back all these blacks to the country where they come from.
Now, you claim in this manifesto of yours that within 50 years, well before 50 years, indigenous British people will be in a minority in this country. Can you define indigenous, please?
Yep. English, Scots, Irish, Welsh, people who've been here overall, in fact, their ancestry for thousands of years.
I'm trying to get what you define as a true British person.
It's anyone who effectively is so melded into the majority English British population that nobody knows, nobody cares.
So the matter of their skin colour is neither here nor there?
No, that is, because one of the symptoms of being English or Scottish or Irish or Welsh is being what the BBC would call white. There's two meanings to British. There's the civic sense and there's the ethnic sense. Right. Ethnically, you cannot be English if you're Chinese, for instance, obviously. But someone who's perhaps been born here, whose parents came here from the West Indies 40, 50 years ago, of course, civically, they are British, but ethnically, they're not.
We're all born under this flag. We was all born under this flag. And we'll live in this flag. And if you stop this flag, what happens next? Which flag's next?
Multiculturalism, the legacy of the Windrush generation, is under attack from politicians at the highest level.
People have realized that that can't work, because Britain, let's face it, is a multicultural society that we live in today, whether you want to accept it or not. And under the multicultural system, things have to change.
Some still found themselves excluded from the umbrella of Britishness. Institutional racism remained an issue.
I'm Merwin Eversley. I was born in Barbados and came here in '65. In the Falklands, I served with like the 2nd Battalion and the Parachute Regiment A Company. I was trained as a soldier, and basically it's either you or the other guy. In those terms, when you're there, into your open fire on, that's it, you'll either fire back and keep their head down, or else you'll be coming home in a body bag, basically. What actually happened, I think, because I came here as a British citizen from Barbados, because Barbados was still a colony. I was here for about a year or so, and in 67, Barbados got independence, so therefore I ceased to become a British citizen, apparently. And I was actually serving in the military at the time, and I think Zola Budd had come over, and the BBC had paid for her, or one of the companies had paid for her citizenship and all the rest of it. and I'd applied for mine, and they said to me, oh well no, sorry, you're no longer entitled to it and you have to pay. So I offered them my medals and said, well, they're worth whatever. And I just decided, well, if I'd have been killed, you wouldn't have sort of like draped a Barbados flag over my coffin. So why should I have to pay for my citizenship? And in fact I sold my medals, and then that paid for my citizenship. But I suppose it was because she was white South African, and the paper, or the Daily Mail or whatever, could pay for her to have her citizenship. So I don't really need them. I know I earn my medals. The lads I served with know I earned my medals or whatever, so I don't really need them. It made me feel like an immigrant, which I am, and I was an immigrant.
I think when you join the army, you don't really realise the full potential of what signing on the dotted line meant. I think we thought it was a case of, yes, you're going to have a certain amount of discipline, you're going to learn to shoot, etc., etc. But the other side is when you go to a place of conflict and people are trying to kill you. First of all, we had to get naturalised, which is a major issue. You fought for the country. Some people have died, and we weren't British citizens. I don't understand. I will never understand how that happened, and how the government allowed it to happen. Because for that £70, a lot of goodwill was lost. When we was in Ireland, the IRA put up on the wall, "Do not shoot the blacks. They are oppressed enough in England." So all the black shouts were saying, "Fucking hell, they're not shooting at you lot." And I said, listen, just go away. A bullet does not differentiate between black and white, so don't be stupid.
In many cases, the skills and experiences they had gained in the war made them better qualified than white workers.
At first, a lot of people assumed if you were from the colony, you couldn't. But in many cases, I was a technical person, and some of them were not. Able to actually come to England, and as soon as you came to England, the first thing they gave you was, because of your certificate and your training, don't worry, you got a big job straight away in the engineering field.
Gradually, the West Indian and African communities began to find or create places for themselves within British society. They brought their talents and abilities into mainstream culture, into industry, entertainment, and politics.
Well, I would come from a singing family because Ever Wilmot is a singer, and I decided to try my luck singing in the clubs, which I was a bit successful because at that time anything was American, any entertainment, black entertainment was American, and I survived for a while until a friend of mine got the idea to form a group, a singing group, and that's where I more or less took off.
Come on, try again. Come on. That's better. I love you so.
Thank you very much, the Southlanders.
Spirituals, rhythm and blues, because that was the thing at the time. That was before Calypso. Calypso came onwards, but that didn't last. That Calypso did Collapso. We had a hit in Germany, and we used to do a lot of shows in Germany, most of the American bases, and our hit record was played all over the continent. I always wanted a car, and this was my first royalty check that I bought this car with, which was quite a scene at the time, because seeing a black guy driving a convertible, was something unusual.
He made his breakthrough really, I think, on Tonight, which was a
in the
program
60s.
that was, late 50s, early 60s, where he sang a topical calypso.
Every night.
He said, turn the faces red, he suggested American blood be shed. The briefest comment to date was the president's round of 108. We bring you the news you ought to know in tonight's topical calypso.
He was the first sort of black person on telly. He started acting, and then he got a small part with Laurence Olivier to go to New York. Caesar and Cleopatra with Vivian Lee. I mean, he had the littlest parts holding a thing, spear. You know how they did it, a black guy. He was sort of in front of Vivian Lee, who didn't like it, you know.
Still no word from Commodore Goddard's plane since they hit that freak storm, sir.
He was Lieutenant Green in Captain Scarlet. And yeah, that was actually something to his... the royalties of that one kept him happy for quite a while. Described himself as an angry black man who had suffered prejudice in this country. And even though we all thought, you know, he was always so well regarded, there was always people in our house who was fan mail, and, you know, I never saw that side, but he obviously felt it hugely.
By accident, I became the mayor of Southwark in 1983. I was always active in the community, and they said I should become a councillor. I became a councillor, and I knew about housing. And after about 6 months as a councillor in Southwark, they said they're going to make me the mayor of Southwark next year. When I went home, my wife was in bed, I said, Mother, you know these people are silly. They said they're going to make me the mayor of Southwark next year. She said, son, you've got no ambition. You could be anything if you wanted. And next year they made me the mayor of Southwark. The National Front, about 2 weeks before I was to be mayor, let it be known that if Sam King becomes the mayor of Southwark, they're going to slit my throat and burn down my house. My reply was, I'm a Christian. I'm not against them slitting my throat, but they should not burn down my house because it's not a council house. And give the newspaper their due. Even the Daily Mail had 2 inches in the front page. This man volunteered during the war, and they made him the mayor of Southwark. Who should say he shouldn't be the mayor?
We are now increasingly aware of what all servicemen and women go through in war. Post-traumatic stress, displacement, alienation, difficulties in adjusting to civilian life. These are all recognized as consequences of combat experiences.
It is psychologically quite damning when you have to look between your sights and there's somebody in those sights and you have to pull the trigger. It is not a very nice thing to do. And you know, when I never forget when I had come back from a particular place and I had to take Mummy shopping and a car backfired and I rolled over and I went behind. And remember, I'm in Civilian Street and she goes, son, what's wrong? And I said, oh, it's okay, Mummy, nothing. And I said to some of my army guys that I thought that any soldier who've been on active service, who have come under fire, who have had to return fire, should not be allowed out of the army for at least 2 years, maybe 3 years, depending on the severity of where he's been, because it's in your conscious, subconscious or whatever, it's in there.
Organizations, including the Royal British Legion and the West Indian Association of Service Personnel, or WASP, are helping veterans to adjust to civilian life.
Many ex-military are on the street, numbers of them now, and even after the war. People are taken apart to train as soldiers. Their whole thinking, their mind is rejigged, and they become killing machines in a sense, because that's what you have to do. And some of the experiences that they've had have really traumatized them, and therefore when they come back, they leave the military service, they are just not together. They find it very hard to settle. Here they are, they've been demobbed, they're back in Civil Street, and they're like, what do I do now? And they end up on the streets, they end up as alcoholics, they end up as drug addicts.
We now have more service personnel coming from the Caribbean. And to that end, whereas before you may be looking at accommodation or welfare and so forth, you're now looking towards post-traumatic stress, you know, disablement. WASP has changed and it's evolved into this new organisation that is looking to provide the needs for our service personnel as they come back.
Recognition is coming, albeit belatedly and slowly. The Commonwealth Memorial Gates near Buckingham Palace were unveiled in 2002 to commemorate more than 5 million volunteers from the Indian subcontinent, Africa, and the Caribbean who served in the wars. West Indian ex-servicemen and women make an annual pilgrimage to the Seaford Memorial Cemetery in East Sussex to remember fallen comrades buried there.
We gather here today to remember those who lie at peace in this cemetery. They all answered the call, but some were destined never to return to their homes.
May God bless all those who died, and may we live as long as possible to give fair respect to our comrades. I thank you.
So people back home don't know that the folks didn't come back. No one told them. It's just because they told us that some of our boys buried there. The government didn't tell us. Oh, not our government, it didn't tell us.
Black ex-servicemen and women marched together as a group in Whitehall in the Remembrance Day parade. They have campaigned to be included. Every year now, WASP stages a commemorative march in Brixton to Windrush Square. Ex-servicemen and women, serving military, cadets, police and firefighters take part.
Ice, no! Ice, no! Ice, no! Ice.
At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them all together. We will remember them.
I want to pay tribute to those who came from far and wide, because without their help, both currently and in the past, the forces of the United Kingdom alone would never have been able to manage to fight the First and Second World Wars.
It's an experience to actually bridge the gap between the two cultures, because now, my children, they put tomato ketchup on rice and peas, you know, which is a sacrilege, you know, but it's something that you can see how the two cultures are trying to mix together.
People, they say that because we're black, we're not allowed in this country, but they don't know all of their past history. People from their family could be black, because my great-granddad is a white person.
Things and times has changed, because I can remember the days I went to Brixton. This is going back about 1947. And I'll walk around Brixton looking for another black face. And when I tell people that, they say, oh, how old are you? But this happened in 1947. And the whole world has changed with independence and everything.
In my house, I would carry a Jamaican flag, a British flag, an African flag, and a European flag, because that's effectively what we've almost become.
No two-person or 3 or 4 person has got the same heart and soul, and you find that because one has do you a harm from a country that you don't care for, you're going to say everybody's the same thing. That's what they say about Jamaicans, but you can't follow that up. What we've got to do is challenge these type of distinctions, discrimination.
One of the things that really concerns me is that after 70 years,
we still do not recognise the contribution that black people made to the war, both on the home front and in the services.
I don't think there's been sufficient recognition for black people and their effort in the war. And I think it's only now that maybe people are becoming aware, slightly, not hugely, that black people even fought for this country.
Now you've learnt something that people haven't learnt in my home.